The iron cage stood like a grim sentinel in the heart of Willow Creek's dusty town square, its rusted bars glinting dully under the noonday sun. Inside, a young woman, barely past her 17th year, pressed herself against the cold metal, her face streaked with dirt and tears. A crude wooden sign dangled from the cage, its painted words stark and merciless, property of Elias Harrow. Debt unpaid, the townsfolk of Willow Creek, a hardscrabble settlement in the Nebraska Territory of 1887, milled about some whispering, some jeering, most avoiding the girl's pleading eyes. It was a spectacle of cruelty, and no one seemed willing to challenge it. Jacob Harroway, a weathered rancher of 52, reined in his horse at the edge of the square, his calloused hands tightening on the leather straps until his knuckles paled. He'd seen his share of hardship droughts that killed crops, blizzards that buried cattle, men who'd kill for $1, but the scene churned his gut in a way he hadn't felt in decades. The girl in the cage, with her torn calico dress and trembling shoulders, could have been anyone's daughter. She could have been his daughter, the one he'd lost, two choices he'd never stop regretting. Jacob dismounted, his boots stirring clouds of dust as he strode toward the cage. The crowd parted slightly, their murmurs growing quieter, sensing something in the set of his jaw, the steel in his gray eyes. He was no stranger to Willow Creek, though he kept to himself on his small ranch 10 miles out of town. Folks called him a loner, a man who'd turned his back on the world after a life of mistakes. But today, something pulled him forward, something stronger than his instinct to stay clear of trouble. "What's your story?" Jacob asked, his voice low but carrying over the crowd's hum. He directed the question at no one in particular, but an old man with a face like cracked leather stepped forward, wiping tobacco juice from his chin. "That's Clara Beaumont," the old-timer said, spitting into the dirt. "Her pa owed Elias Harrow $300 for seed and supplies. Died last spring, left her with the debt. Harrow says if she don't pay by dusk, she stays caged till someone buys her contract or worse." Jacob's jaw tightened. $300 was a fortune in Willow Creek, more than most families saw in a year, and he knew what buying her contract meant. Elias Harrow wasn't just a moneylender, he was a vulture who preyed on desperation, funneling girls like Clara into a network of saloons and worse across the territory. Jacob had heard the story of girls who vanished, their names forgotten, their lives bartered like cattle. He stepped closer to the cage, close enough to see the bruises on Clara's wrists where the bars had bitten into her skin. Her green eyes met his, wide with fear but flickering with a spark of defiance. For a moment, time seemed to still. Those eyes weren't just hers, they were Margaret's, his daughter, the one he'd failed 25 years ago. Margaret, who'd died at 4 from smallpox while Jacob was off chasing bounties, too stubborn to stay home with the woman he'd loved but never married. The guilt had carved a hollow in him, one he'd carried every day since. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the crowd's murmurs. "I didn't do anything wrong." Jacob's hand drifted to his vest pocket, where a worn leather pouch held his last $27 every cent from his latest cattle sale, meant for seed, repairs, and surviving the winter. It wasn't enough, not even close, but as he looked at Clara, he felt a truth settle over him like a storm cloud. Some debts weren't paid in coin. Some were paid in choices. Heavy boots crunched behind him, and Jacob turned to see Elias Harrow approaching, his tailored suit and polished boots out of place in the dusty square. The man's thin mustache curled into a smirk, his eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who owned half the town. "Well, now," Harrow called out, his voice smooth as oil. "Looks like our little display has drawn some interest. Anyone care to bid on Miss Beaumont's contract before I move her to more lucrative arrangements?" The crowd shifted, some looking away, others leaning in, drawn by the promise of drama. Jacob's hand tightened on his money pouch. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to save his meager savings, to let someone else deal with Harrow's cruelty. But Clara's eyes held him fast, and he knew he couldn't turn his back. "Not this time. I'll cover her debt," Jacob said, his voice cutting through the square like a whip crack. The murmurs stopped, replaced by a tense silence. Harrow's smirk widened, revealing a glint of silver in his teeth. Jacob Haraway, the solitary rancher, Harrow said, stepping closer. Didn't peg you for a savior. $300, you say? Let's see the money. Jacob pulled out his pouch and counted the bills deliberately, aware of every eye on him. Clara gripped the bars, her breath catching as hope flickered in her face. I've got $27, Jacob said, holding up the crumpled bills. But I'll work off the rest. Whatever it takes. Harrow's laugh was sharp, like a blade on a whetstone. $27? That's not even a down payment, Haraway. And the debt's not $300 any more interest, you see. It's $400 now, compounding daily. The crowd gasped, and Clara's face fell, the hope draining from her eyes. Jacob felt the words like a punch to the chest. $400 was impossible, a sum that mocked his offer. The old-timer who'd spoken earlier stepped forward, his voice shaking. You said $300 at sundown, Harrow. That was the deal. Harrow shrugged, adjusting his silk cravat. Business evolves, my friend. The girl's value decreases by the hour, and my patience isn't free. Jacob's blood boiled, the kind of anger that had landed him in trouble before bar fights. Bounties gone wrong, nights spent in jail cells. He thought of his failing ranch, the leaking roof, the barren fields. He thought of Margaret, buried in a pauper's grave because he'd been too proud to settle down. And he thought of Clara, who deserved better than a cage. I'll work for you, Jacob said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. A month, 2 months later you need to clear the $400. Let her go. The crowd stirred, a mix of shock and unease. Harrow's eyes gleamed with interest, like a coyote spotting a wounded deer. Now that's an offer, he said, circling the cage. Jacob Haraway, the man who walked away from bounty hunting, offering his services. They say you were a killer once, Haraway. Fast hands, no mercy. Is that true? Jacob didn't answer. The stories about him, 3 men dead in a saloon in Cheyenne. Another in a duel outside Omaha weren't lies, but they weren't the whole truth either. Those ghosts followed him, whispering in the quiet of his lonely nights. Do we have a deal? Jacob pressed, his voice steady despite the rage in his chest. Harrow tapped a finger against the cage, making Clara flinch. Here's my counteroffer, he said. You want the girl? She's yours, debt cleared. But you work for me for 1 month, starting with a job tomorrow. A simple collection matter. Do it right, and Miss Beaumont walks free. Fail, and well, let's just say I have other cages. Jacob felt the trap closing around him. Harrow's collection jobs weren't about knocking on doors for overdue payments. They involved broken bones, burned homes, lives ruined. But Clara's eyes were on him again, pleading, and he saw Margaret in the Margaret, who might have lived if he'd been a better man. 1 month, Jacob said, the words heavy as lead. But she stays with me, not you. Harrow's laugh was cold. Agreed. She's free to go for now. But you, Haraway, you're mine for 30 days. He produced a key and unlocked the cage with a flourish, as if he were freeing a bird from a gilded cage. Clara stumbled out, her legs giving way, and Jacob caught her before she hit the ground. She weighed next to nothing, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Thank you, she whispered, clutching his arm. Thank you. But across the square, 3 men in dark coats watched from the shadows of the general store, their hands resting on their revolvers. Harrow gave them a subtle nod, and Jacob knew this deal was far from simple. He'd just traded 1 cage for another, and the real price was yet to be paid. Jacob led Clara to his horse, helping her up behind him. She clung to his waist, her breathing uneven, as they rode out of Willow Creek toward his ranch. The town square faded behind them, but the weight of what he'd done grew heavier with every mile. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the prairie, and Jacob's mind raced. Harrow's men would be watching, waiting for him to slip. And Clarapur, brave Clara, was now his responsibility, a living reminder of the daughter he'd failed. Why'd you do it? She asked, her voice soft against the creak of the saddle. You don't even know me. Jacob didn't answer right away. How could he explain Margaret? How could he tell her about the woman he'd loved, Eliza, who'd begged him to stay, to build a life together? How he'd chosen the open road instead, chasing bounties and glory, only to learn Eliza had died of smallpox while he was gone, taking their daughter with her. The guilt was a stone in his chest, one he'd carried for 25 years. "Some things a man's gotta do," he said finally, "even if they don't make sense." His ranch came into view, a modest spread of weathered wood and patchy fields. The house was small, its porch sagging, but it was his-earned through years of sweat and solitude. As they approached, Clara stiffened behind him. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. Jacob's heart sank. The front door was ajar, his few belongings scattered across the porch, books torn. A chair overturned, his old rifle missing from its place above the fireplace. He slid off the horse, drawing his revolver. "Stay here," he told Clara, his voice low. He moved toward the house, every sense alert. The destruction inside was deliberate. His mattress slashed, flour sacks dumped, plates shattered. This wasn't theft, it was a message. A shadow moved in the doorway, and Jacob spun, gun raised. "Easy, Haraway," a voice drawled. A man stepped forward, tall and weary, a scar cutting across his cheek like a crescent moon. He held a small tin box, Jacob's only keepsake, containing a locket with Eliz's hair and a drawing Margaret had made before she died. "Name's Gideon Holt," the man said, his tone casual but his eyes cold. "Mr. Harrow sent me to clarify a few things about your deal." Jacob kept his gun trained on Gideon. "What's there to clarify?" Gideon opened the tin box, pulling out the locket. "Harrow knows things, Haraway. About you, about your past. About a woman named Eliza Monroe and a little girl who didn't make it past 4. Funny how history repeats itself, ain't it? You standing up for this Beaumont girl like you couldn't for your own." Jacob's finger twitched on the trigger. Harrow had dug deep, unearthing secrets Jacob had buried long ago. "Get to the point," he growled. "The point is leverage," Gideon said, slipping the locket back into the box. "You do tomorrow's job right, Colic from Widow Grayson. Make her understand she needs to sell her land or Harrow starts talking. About Eliza, about how she died, about rumors that maybe it wasn't just smallpox. People in Willow Creek love a scandal, especially when it involves a man like you." Jacob's blood ran cold. He'd always suspected Eliz's death wasn't natural. The town doctor, a man with a grudge against Jacob for turning him in for fraud, had been too quick to call it smallpox, too eager to close the case. But Jacob had no proof, only guilt and questions that haunted him. "What's the job?" Jacob asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Widow Grayson," Gideon said, smirking, "owes Harrow $75 for her husband's medical bills. With interest, it's $300 now. She's got a little farm on Sycamore Lane. Harrow wants it. You convince her to sell, or we make sure she regrets it. And that girl out there," he nodded toward Clara, still on the horse, "she's not safe unless you play along." Jacob glanced outside, where Clara watched nervously, clutching the reins. "She comes with me," he said. "That's non-negotiable." Gideon shrugged. "For now, but you're on a short leash, Haraway. Tomorrow, Sycamore Lane. Don't disappoint." As Gideon sauntered away, Jacob felt the walls of his world closing in. He'd made a deal with the devil, and the price was steeper than he'd imagined. Clara called his name, her voice trembling, and he realized the choice he faced tomorrow wasn't just about a widow's farm, it was about who he was and who he'd failed to be. That night, Jacob sat on his porch, the tin box heavy in his hands. Inside, Eliz's locket gleamed faintly in the moonlight, a reminder of promises broken. Clara slept inside, curled up on his cot, her soft breathing a contrast to the chaos of the day. She'd insisted on cleaning the mess Gideon's men had left, working with a quiet determination that broke Jacob's heart. She was stronger than she looked, but she was still a child caught in a man's war. He opened the locket, staring at the curl of Eliz's hair. She'd been 20 when they met, a school teacher with a laugh that could light up a room. He'd loved her, but he'd been too restless, too proud to settle down. When she told him she was pregnant, he'd promised to come back after one last bounty. He hadn't. By the time he returned, Eliza and Margaret were gone, and the doctor's smug face had told him everything he needed to know. "Couldn't sleep," Clara's voice came from the doorway. She stood there, wrapped in one of his old shirts, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked fragile but resolute, like a flower growing through cracked stone. "Just thinking," Jacob said, closing the locket. She sat beside him on the porch steps, keeping a careful distance. About tomorrow? Or something else? He hesitated, then found himself telling her everything about Eliza, about Margaret, about the doctor who'd gotten away with murder. He told her about the bounties he'd chased, the men he'd killed, the life he'd tried to build to atone for it all. He didn't know why he told her, only that her green eyes seemed to pull the truth from him, piece by painful piece. "You think saving me makes up for losing them?" Clara asked, her voice gentle but piercing. "Maybe," Jacob admitted. "Or maybe I just can't stand seeing another girl pay for someone else's sins." Clara looked out at the starry prairie, her expression unreadable. "My pa was like you in a way. Good heart, bad choices. He borrowed from Harrow to keep our farm going after Ma died. Thought he could work it off, but Harrow's debts never get smaller. They just grow until they swallow you whole." Jacob felt her words like a blade. Harrow didn't want money. He wanted control, power over lives and souls. And tomorrow, Jacob would have to face Widow Grayson, a woman he vaguely remembered as kind but frail, living alone since her husband's death. Intimidating her would be easy, but it would mean stepping deeper into Harrow's world, a place where men like Jacob became monsters. "What happens tomorrow?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob looked at the horizon, where dawn would soon break. "I ride to Sycamore Lane. After that, we'll see." But as he spoke, he knew it wasn't that simple. Tomorrow, he'd face a choice: obey Harrow and betray his conscience, or defy him and risk every Thinkler's freedom, his own secrets, the fragile hope of redemption. And somewhere in Willow Creek, a doctor who'd poisoned his family was still living, untouched by justice. For the first time in years, Jacob felt the stirrings of something he'd thought long dead: purpose. As dawn broke over Willow Creek, Jacob Harroway knew the hardest day of his life lay ahead. The prairie sky glowed pink and gold, but its beauty felt like a mockery of the choice he faced. He stood in his yard, saddling his horse, while Clara Beaumont watched from the porch, her green eyes shadowed with worry. She'd risen before him, brewing coffee and packing a small bag of supplies, as if she belonged to this broken-down ranch and its broken-down owner. But Jacob knew better. Belonging was a luxury neither of them could afford, not with Elias Harrow's shadow looming over them. "You don't have to do this," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "We could leave, Jacob. Right now, both of us." He tightened the saddle's cinch, checking his revolver for the third time. "Run where?" "Harrow's got men from here to Omaha, and Gideon made it clear what happens if I don't show up." Clara stepped closer, her borrowed shirt hanging loose on her slight frame. "So you're really going to threaten an old woman? Widow Grayson doesn't deserve this." The question cut deeper than Jacob wanted to admit. He'd spent the night wrestling with it, staring at Eliz's locket, replaying Gideon Holt's words about leverage and secrets. Widow Grayson Eleanor Grayson, he recollected, was pushing 70, living alone on a small farm since her husband passed from fever 2 years back. Harrow's claim of a $300 debt, inflated from 75, was a familiar trap, the kind that had snared Clara's father and countless others. Jacob could ride to Sycamore Lane, deliver Harrow's message, and secure Clara's freedom. Or he could refuse and risk Harrow exposing his past rumors about Eliz's death, whispers of poison, a truth Jacob had never proved but always suspected. "I'm going to Sycamore Lane," he said finally, mounting his horse. "What happens there, we'll see." Clara's face hardened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she handed him a tin of biscuits she'd baked from his meager stores. "For the road," she said, "and Jacob didn't let him turn you into something you're not." He nodded, unable to meet her eyes, and spurred his horse toward Sycamore Lane. The ride took 40 minutes, each mile heavy with dread. The prairie stretched wide and empty, dotted with cottonwoods and the occasional crumbling fence. Jacob's mind churned, weighing his options. He could intimidate Eleanor, scare her into signing over her pharmacy enough for a man with his reputation. Or he could defy Harrow, but that meant Clara back in a cage, his secrets laid bare, and no guarantee of justice for Eliza and Margaret. A third option flickered, faint and dangerous: find a way to outmaneuver Harrow without bloodshed. But men like Harrow didn't leave room for cleverness. They thrived on fear and force. The Grayson farm appeared in a shallow valley, its white clapboard house neat but weathered. Green shutters faded by years of sun. The barn sagged under a half-collapsed roof, and the fields showed more weeds than crops. As Jacob approached, the front door opened, and Eleanor Grayson stepped onto the porch. Her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her patched dress clean but threadbare. Behind her stood a younger man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a lawman's stance that made Jacob's hand hover near his gun. "Mr. Haraway," Eleanor called, shading her eyes against the morning light. "Didn't expect you out this way. You remember my grandson, Samuel?" Samuel Grayson stepped forward, his sharp blue eyes scanning Jacob with the precision of a man who'd worn a badge. A faint tan line on his vest marked where a sheriff's star usually hung. Jacob recalled hearing Samuel had been a lawman in Kansas City before coming to visit his grandmother. His presence complicated things. Shero hadn't mentioned a grandson, and Jacob doubted it was an oversight. "Ma'am," Jacob said, touching his hat brim. "Samuel, I'm here about Elias Harrow." Eleanor's face paled, and Samuel's hand rested casually near his revolver. "What about Harrow?" Samuel asked, his tone polite but edged with suspicion. Jacob dismounted, keeping his movements slow. "He says your grandmother owes him $300 from a $75 loan for your grandfather's medicine. He wants the farm as payment." "That's nonsense," Samuel snapped, stepping off the porch. "Grandma doesn't owe a dime to that snake." But Eleanor shook her head, her eyes glistening. "It's true, Samuel. I borrowed for the laudanum when your grandfather was dying. Harrow called it a loan, said I'd have time to pay. But now $300? I don't have that kind of money." Jacob felt a familiar sickness in his gut. Harrow's loans were never meant to be repaid. They were chains, binding people to his will. "There's more," he said, his voice low. "Harrow sent me to make sure you understand the consequences of not paying. He wants the deed signed over by tomorrow." Samuel's hand moved to his gun, his jaw tight. "You threatening my grandmother, Haraway?" "No," Jacob said, meeting Samuel's gaze. "I'm warning you. Harrow's coming himself if this doesn't go his way. And he won't come alone." As if on cue, this rose on the horizon, 3 riders approaching fast. Jacob recognized Gideon Holt's lean silhouette in the lead, flanked by 2 men in dark coats, their hands already on their weapons. Harrow hadn't trusted Jacob to handle the job alone. This was a test, and failure meant blood. "Get inside," Jacob told Eleanor and Samuel, drawing his revolver. "Both of you. Samuel, load that gun." Eleanor grabbed her grandson's arm, her voice trembling. "What's happening, Jacob? What did you do?" Jacob watched the riders close in, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. "What I should have done 25 years ago," he said. "I'm making a stand." Gideon reined up 20 feet from the porch, his scar catching the sunlight. His companion's a burly man with a patchy beard, and a weary one with a missing ear flanked him, their guns drawn but low. "Morning, Haraway," Gideon called, his voice dripping with mock cheer. "Had a nice chat with Mrs. Grayson." Jacob kept his revolver steady, his heart pounding. "Message delivered, Gideon. You can tell Harrow the debt's not legitimate. $75 doesn't turn into $300 because he says so." Gideon laughed, a sound like dry leaves crunching. "You're talking law, Haraway, but Harrow is the law around here. Owns the sheriff, the judge, most of the town council. Who's gonna stop him?" The burly man, Dutch, Jacob figured, spoke up, his voice gravelly. "Enough talk. Let's torch the barn and move on." "Now, Dutch, patience," Gideon said, his eyes never leaving Jacob. "Mrs. Grayson needs to see what happens when debts go unpaid. And our friend Haraway needs a lesson in loyalty." Jacob's mind raced. 3 against 1, with Eleanor and Samuel caught in the crossfire. The farmhouse walls wouldn't stop bullets, and Samuel's lawman training might not be enough against hired killers. But Gideon's confidence gave Jacob an idea, a desperate one, born of years watching men like Harrow operate. "Tell me something, Gideon," Jacob said, raising his voice so Samuel could hear from inside. "Does Harrow know you've been skimming his collections?" The accusation landed like a thunderclap. Gideon's smile flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Dutch and the weary man exchanged glances, their hands tightening on their guns. "That's a bold claim," Gideon said, his tone careful. "Got proof?" Jacob took a step forward, gambling everything on a bluff. "I've got eyes, Gideon. Saw you pocket extra from the Miller debt last month. Told Harrow it was $50. When you collected 80. And the Thompson loan? Marked uncollectible, but Thompson's been dead 3 years. Funny how those numbers don't add up." Gideon's hand drifted toward his revolver, but Dutch was already eyeing him with suspicion. Honor among thieves was fragile, especially when money was at stake. "You're lying," Gideon said, but his voice lacked its earlier swagger. "Maybe," Jacob replied. "Or maybe I've been keeping a tally, dates, amounts, witnesses. What's Harrow gonna say when he hears his top man's been stealing?" The tension in the yard was palpable, like the air before a storm. Dutch's gaze shifted fully to Gideon, and the weary man Miller. Jacob edged his horse back, sensing trouble. "That true, Gideon," Dutch growled. "You holding out on us?" Gideon spun toward Dutch, his gun half drawn. "Don't be stupid, Dutch. He's playing you." But Samuel's voice cut through from the doorway, his rifle trained on Gideon. "I'm listening, and I've got a badge that says I can arrest all 3 of you for conspiracy to commit arson. Federal crime, federal jurisdiction. And defrauding Harrow's business? That's a charge I can make stick." Jacob seized the moment. "Here's the deal," he said, his voice steady. "You 3 ride back to town. Dutch and Miller tell Harrow what Gideon's been up to. Gideon, you've got bigger problems than collecting debts now." For a heartbeat, everything hung in the balance for men with guns, each calculating their next move. Then Dutch made the choice. "You son of a," he snarled, drawing on Gideon. The yard erupted in chaos. Gideon fired first, his bullet grazing Dutch's arm. Dutch's shot went wide, splintering the porch railing. Miller panicked, firing at Jacob, who'd have behind a water trough, returning fire. His bullet caught Miller in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. Samuel's rifle roared, and Dutch clutched his side, spurring his horse into a gallop as he fled over the hill, leaving a trail of dust and blood. When the smoke cleared, Gideon lay in the dirt, blood seeping from his arm, his gun a few feet away. Miller groaned, clutching his shoulder, still alive but out of the fight. Jacob rose, his heart pounding, and checked Gideon's wound. It was clean painful, but not fatal. "It's not over," Gideon gasped, his eyes burning with hate. "Harrow'll come himself now, and he'll bring hell with him." Jacob knelt beside him, his voice cold. "Maybe, but now he knows his own men are turning on him. Hard to run an empire when you can't trust your dogs." Samuel emerged from the house, rifle still ready, Eleanor behind him, her face pale but resolute. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jacob looked toward Willow Creek, where dust still lingered from Dutch's retreat. "Now you pack what matters," he said. "You and Samuel get out of Nebraska. Harrow won't stop, not after this." Samuel lowered his rifle, his eyes sharp. "And you? What's your plan?" Jacob reloaded his revolver, the weight of it familiar in his hand. "I go back to my ranch. Clara's there, and Harrow's men might already be. Then I finish this, one way or another." Eleanor grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You didn't have to do this, Jacob. Why risk it all for us?" He thought of Eliza, of Margaret, of the years spent running from his failures. "Because some debts aren't about money," he said, "and some fights are worth having." The ride back to his ranch was a blur. Gideon's words echoing in Jacob's mind. Harrow'll bring hell with him. If Harrow had sent men to watch Clara, she could be in danger or worse. Jacob pushed his horse hard, the prairie blurring past, his heart racing with fear for the girl who'd become his responsibility. As his ranch came into view, relief washed over him. Clara stood on the porch, his missing rifle in her hands, aimed at 2 men sitting in the dirt with their hands raised. A third lay dead near the barn, his horse grazing nearby. Jacob dismounted, his boots hitting the ground hard. "Clara," he called. "About time," she replied, her voice steady, but her eyes wide with adrenaline. "These fellas came looking for you. Said they had a message from Harrow." Jacob approached, taking in the scene. The dead man had a bullet clean through his chest. Clara's work, no doubt. The 2 survivors were young, barely out of their teens, their faces pale with fear. "What happened?" Jacob asked. Clara lowered the rifle slightly, her hands steady. "Pa was a lousy gambler, but he taught me to shoot. These boys thought I'd be easy pickings. Didn't expect me to know my way around a trigger. The wounded man, a kid with a patchy beard, looked up at Jacob. Harrow's coming, he stammered. Tonight. Says this ends here. Jacob felt the weight of destiny settle on him. Harrow wasn't just coming for Clara or the Grayson farmhouse, was coming to crush anyone who defied him. And somewhere in Willow Creek, Dr. Amos Caldwell, the man who'd likely poisoned Eliza and Margaret, was still breathing. Untouched by justice. Jacob had run from that truth for too long, but now it was catching up. Get what you can carry, he told Clara. We're leaving. She shook her head, her jaw set. Running won't fix this, Jacob. Harrow'll just find someone else to cage, someone else to break. We have to end it. He wanted to argue, to tell her they could start over somewhere far away. But the thunder of hooves cut him off. From the direction of town, a dozen riders appeared, Elias Harrow at their center, his suit pristine despite the dust. But another sound caught Jacob's attention. Hooves from the east. Samuel Grayson rode into view, leading for men with badges, their rifles gleaming in the fading light. The territorial marshal had arrived early, and he'd brought deputies. The two groups converged on Jacob's ranch, Harrow's men forming a half-circle, guns drawn, while the lawmen lined up between them and the house. The marshal, a grizzled man with a scarred face, raised his voice. Elias Harrow, you're under arrest for extortion, conspiracy, and running an illegal debt scheme. Harrow's laugh was sharp and bitter. On whose authority? I own Willow Creek. Federal authority, Samuel replied, stepping forward. And federal law trumps your corruption. For a moment, the yard was silent, every man waiting for the spark that would ignite the powder keg. Then Harrow made his choice. Kill them, he snarled. The gunfight was brutal and swift. Harrow's men, caught in a crossfire between the house and the lawmen, had no cover. The marshal's deputies fired with precision, cutting down half of Harrow's crew in seconds. Clara's rifle cracked from the porch, dropping a man who'd aimed at Jacob. Samuel's shot caught Harrow in the leg as he tried to flee, sending him sprawling behind a wagon. Jacob moved through the chaos, his revolver steady, taking down two of Harrow's men before they could fire. When the smoke cleared, the yard was a graveyard, bodies scattered, horses snorting in panic. Harrow lay behind the wagon, clutching his leg, his face twisted in pain and rage. Jacob approached, his gun trained on the man who'd ruled Willow Creek through fear. Should have let her go, Jacob said. Could have avoided all this. Harrow spat blood, his eyes wild. You're nothing, Harroway. Just a washed-up killer with a guilty conscience. Maybe, Jacob said. But I'm still standing. Harrow's men were dead or surrendered, the marshal's deputies rounding them up. Clara joined Jacob, her rifle still in hand, her face pale but resolute. It's not over yet, she said, glancing toward town. Not until everyone pays. Jacob nodded, his thoughts turning to Dr. Caldwell. Harrow's empire was crumbling, but the man who'd taken Eliza and Margaret was still out there. The fight at Sycamore Lane had been a victory, but the real reckoning was waiting in Willow Creek. The dust had barely settled from the fight at Sycamore Lane when Jacob Harroway realized the real battle was waiting back at his ranch. The sun hung low, painting the prairie in shades of crimson, as if the land itself bled from the day's violence. Elias Harrow lay dead behind a wagon, his empire of fear and debt shattered. But Jacob's heart still raced. Clara Beaumont stood beside him, her rifle lowered, but her green eyes burning with resolve. The territorial marshal and his deputies were rounding up the last of Harrow's men. But Jacob knew this wasn't the end, not while Dr. Amos Caldwell, the man who'd likely poisoned his family, still walked free in Willow Creek. We need to go to town, Jacob said, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. There's one more debt to settle. Clara nodded, her face pale but determined. Caldwell, she said, reading his mind. You think he's part of this? I know he is, Jacob replied, checking his revolver's cylinder. Harrow's ledgers will prove it. He kept records of every dirty deal, every blackmail scheme. If Caldwell poisoned Eliza and Margaret, Harrow knew and used it to keep him in line. Samuel Grayson approached, his sheriff's instinct sharp as he cleaned his rifle. You're talking about the doctor? Amos Caldwell? He's been Willow Creek's pillar of respectability for 20 years. You sure about this, Haraway? Jacob's jaw tightened. Sure as I've ever been. And I'm done waiting for justice. The marshal, a grizzled man named Barrett, overheard and stepped in, his scarred face unreadable. If you've got evidence, Haraway, we'll handle it. Federal law doesn't care how respectable a man looks. But you ride into town guns blazing, and you're no better than Harrow's crew. Jacob met Barrett's gaze, feeling the weight of 25 years of regret. I'm not looking to kill him, Marshal. I just want the truth. Clara touched his arm, her voice soft but firm. We'll get it together. But we do it right, no more blood unless we have to. Jacob nodded, though the fire in his chest burned hotter than ever. He helped Clara onto his horse, and they rode toward Willow Creek, Samuel and two deputies trailing behind. The marshal stayed at the ranch to process prisoners, but his warning echoed in Jacob's mind. Caldwell wasn't just a doctor, was a man with connections. A man who'd buried secrets deeper than graves. Confronting him would be dangerous, and not just for Jacob. The town was quiet as they rode in, the streets eerily still after the chaos of the day. Word of Harrow's downfall had spread, and folks peered from windows, their faces a mix of fear and curiosity. Jacob's ranch had been a battlefield, but Willow Creek's soul was still at stake. They stopped at the sheriff's office, where Harrow's ledgers had been taken for evidence. Samuel flipped through the leather-bound books, his brow furrowing as he scanned the meticulous records. Here, Samuel said, pointing to a page, Caldwell's name. Payments to Harrow, monthly, going back 20 years. Labeled consulting fees, but the amounts are too high for doctoring. Looks like blackmail. Jacob's heart pounded. Anything about Eliza Monroe or Margaret? Samuel shook his head. Not directly, but there's a note, Caldwell, 1862, to Patience, unresolved. That's the year your family died, isn't it? Jacob nodded, his throat tight. Smallpox, Caldwell called it. Closed the case fast, wouldn't let me see the bodies. I was out of town, chasing a bounty. By the time I got back, they were buried. Clara's eyes softened with understanding. You think he poisoned them to cover something up? I think he was in Harrow's pocket even then, Jacob said. And Harrow used it to own him. Barrett's deputy, a young man named Willis, spoke up. Caldwell's at his office now. Saw him through the window, packing bags like he's planning to skip town. Jacob's blood ran cold. He knows Harrow's dead. He's running. Samuel closed the ledger. Then we move now. But we do it by the book arrest, not execution. They headed to Caldwell's office, a tidy brick building at the edge of town. The sign reading Dr. Amos Caldwell, physician, swung gently in the evening breeze. Through the window, Jacob saw the doctor shoving papers into a satchel, his movements frantic. Caldwell was a tall man, 60 now, with thinning hair and a face that carried the weight of respectability. But Jacob saw something else in his hurried pack-inquilt. Samuel knocked on the door, his badge gleaming. Doctor Caldwell, open up. Federal business. The door creaked open and Caldwell stood there, his eyes darting between Jacob, Samuel, and Clara. What's this about? He asked, his voice smooth but strained. We're here about Elias Harrow, Samuel said, and payments you've been making since 1862. Caldwell's face paled, but he forced a smile. Harrow, a patient, nothing more. I don't know what you're implying. Jacob stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. I'm implying you poisoned my wife and daughter, Caldwell. Eliza Monroe and Margaret, dead of smallpox while I was gone. Harrow knew, didn't he? Kept you on a leash all these years. Caldwell's smile vanished. That's absurd. I'm a doctor, not a murderer. Then explain the ledgers, Samuel said, holding up the book. Payments to Harrow, thousands of dollars over 20 years. And a note about to Patience in 62, unresolved. Sounds like a man covering his tracks. Caldwell's eyes flicked to the satchel, then to the back door. Jacob saw them move and blocked his path, his revolver drawn, but low. Don't, he warned. You run, you're admitting it. Clara stepped forward, her voice steady. You let a girl die, Doctor. Caldwell, a 4-year-old who never hurt anyone. And her mother, who trusted you. If you've got a shred of decency, tell the truth. Caldwell's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Jacob thought he'd confess. But then the doctor lunged for the satchel, pulling a derringer from his coat. Jacob reacted faster, grabbing Caldwell's wrist and twisting until the gun clattered to the floor. Samuel pinned the doctor against the wall, cuffing his hands. "You don't understand," Caldwell gasped. "Harrow made me do it. Eliza, she found out I was selling laudanum to Harrow's men, overcharging for it. She threatened to tell the sheriff. Harrow said I had to silence her, or he'd ruin me. And Margaret," Jacob's voice was barely a whisper, his hands shaking with rage. Caldwell's eyes filled with tears. "She was sick already. Smallpox, I swear. I just didn't save her. Gave her too much laudanum, let the fever take her. It was easier than fighting Harrow." Jacob's vision blurred, the room tilting. 25 years of guilt, of wondering if he could have saved them. And here was the truth. Caldwell had killed them to save his own skin. He wanted to draw his gun, to end the man who'd stolen his family. But Clara's hand on his arm stopped him. "He's not worth it," she said. "Let the law have him." Samuel nodded, hauling Caldwell toward the door. "He'll hang for this Harrow way. The ledgers, his confession, it's enough." As they dragged Caldwell to the sheriff's office, the town began to stir. Folks gathered in the streets, whispering about Harrow's fall and now Caldwell's arrest. Jacob felt their eyes on him, some pitying, some accusing. He'd been the loner, the killer, the man who'd walked away from his past. Now, he was something else, a man who'd fought for justice, even if it cost him everything. Back at the sheriff's office, the marshal took Caldwell's statement, the doctor's voice breaking as he detailed his crimes. The ledgers confirmed it all. Harrow had blackmailed Caldwell for decades, using the murders to keep him compliant. Other names surfaced to their debts, other lives ruined. Willow Creek would never be the same. Clara stood beside Jacob as they left the office, the night air cool against their skin. "What now?" she asked, echoing her question from the day before. Jacob looked at the stars, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Now we leave. Start over somewhere new, where the past can't follow." Clara smiled, a real smile this time, not weighed down by fear. "Together." He nodded. "Together." 3 years later, Jacob and Clara owned a small farm in Montana Territory, a patch of green amid rolling hills. They married in a quiet ceremony, witnessed by Samuel Grayson and his grandmother Eleanor, who'd settled nearby. Clara gave birth to a daughter, named Eliza Margaret, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn heart. The past was just that past, buried beneath the weight of a life worth living. Jacob never picked up a gun again. The ranch thrived, not because of luck, but because of honest work, shared with Clara, who proved as fierce with a plow as she'd been with a rifle. Willow Creek faded into memory, its scandals and cages replaced by open skies and second chances. But every now and then, Jacob would sit on his porch, Eliza's locket in his hand, and think of the choices that had brought him here. He'd fought for justice, not just for himself, but for Clara, for Eleanor, for a town crushed under Harrow's boot. And in doing so, he'd found redemption not in erasing the past, but in building something better from its ashes. What did you think of Jacob's journey in Willow Creek? Was his fight against Harrow and Caldwell justified? Or did violence only deepen the cycle of injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe standing up to evil requires force? Or is there another way? Let's hear your perspective on how we confront cruelty and corruption in our own life.